Segregation, you just couldn't go into a large department store and take a seat at a lunch counter. And we felt it was a affront to our own dignity, to our own worth. Every Tuesday night, I started attending these nonviolent workshops, and it was there that I met Jim Lawson.
We saw a wrong, and with our bodies, we went into the situation to correct it.
And he kept saying what we could do as students, as young people. He told us all about what Gandhi attempted to do in South Africa.
We were trained in nonviolent direct action, focused on the lunch counters. And that's what our training was about.
The role plan was conditioning us, preparing us, because we were going to face opposition, possibility of us being beaten. And we had to be prepared. The first morning that we went downtown to participate in sit-ins, I was assigned to go to Woolworth, and we would go in and take our seats, orderly, peaceful, reading a book, writing a paper, all day. And then we would come back the next day, waiting to be served.
February 13th was our first sit-in Nashville. On this sit-in, we had about 130 kids. I think on this day, many of us didn't realize just how important our movement would grow to be.
The targets of the Nashville students were the lunch counters at the city's 2 largest department stores and 4 variety stores. And for the first time, the community was confronted with Negroes in places where they had never been. During the early weeks of February 1960, the demonstrations that came to be called the sit-in movement exploded across the South. Within a period of 2 months, the movement had spread to 65 cities involving every southern state, with the exception of Mississippi. The new tactic came as a surprise, creating bewilderment and confusion in the white communities.
The white people in Nashville were stunned. I mean, they were more than stunned. Their way of life, they felt, was being disregarded.
During the weeks after the sit-ins began, opposition in the white communities of the South solidified, and the first signs of violence appeared. Those few whites who sympathized publicly with the sit-ins soon found themselves to be prime targets.
I have thought for a long time that Negroes should be allowed to sit at the counters where we are served downtown. This is just a part of many things that I think they should be allowed to do. I have felt that it really was not fair for them to be served in the stores as customers and not be allowed certain services, denied certain services within those same stores.
On the morning of the 27th, this was to be our first real violent day. It was the first time when we could really test our own convictions as far as nonviolent means were concerned. 5 ministers said to us, if you go downtown today, you're going to be arrested. Please don't go downtown because we're not prepared. We should have community behind us. Paul LaPrade, he was one of the few white students who were with us. They always pick on the white students because they hate to see white sympathizers.
I saw a bunch of coloreds sitting on the stools. They looked like a bunch of idiots sitting up there waiting for people to try to throw them off, and they looked like they were just trying to egg on a fight.
None of us looked back, but yet we could see everything that was going on through the long mirror. And it seems to me that when it happened, that all of us wanted to be hit. This was an experience that we needed to keep our movement going, to keep ourselves going, and to convince ourselves that we really were nonviolent.
And in spite of all of this, I had to keep loving the people who denied me service.
We knew that we were sticking our necks out to realize that you could get blind or your teeth could get knocked out.
We had to make the point that sometimes you have to put yourself in harm's way. And in the process, you may stir up some violence, but you would not engage in the violence. We were attacked. People were beaten, lighted cigarettes put out down people's back, poured ketchup and hot sauce on people.
Your Royal Highnesses, distinguished guests, comrades and friends, today all us do, by our presence here and by our celebrations in other parts of our country and the world, confer glory and hope to newborn liberty. Out of the experience of an extraordinary human disaster that lasted too long, must be born a society of which all humanity will be proud. Our daily deeds as ordinary South Africans must produce an actual South African reality that will reinforce humanity's belief in justice, strengthen its confidence in the nobility of the human soul, and sustain all our hopes for a glorious life for all. All this we owe both to ourselves and to the peoples of the world who are so well represented here today. To my compatriots, I have no hesitation in saying that each one of us is as intimately attached to the soil of this beautiful country as are the famous jacaranda trees of Pretoria and the mimosa trees of the bushveld. Each time one of us touches the soil of this land, we feel a sense of personal renewal. The national mood changes as the seasons change. We are moved by a sense of joy and exhilaration when the grass turns green and the flowers bloom. That spiritual and physical oneness we all share with this common homeland explains that the depth of the pain we all carried in our hearts as we saw our country tear itself apart in terrible conflict. And as we saw it spent, outlawed, and isolated by the peoples of the world, precisely because it had become the universal base of the pernicious ideology and practice of racism and racial oppression. We, the people of South Africa, feel fulfilled that humanity has taken us back into its bosom, that we, who were outlaws not so long ago, had today be given the rare privilege to be hosted to the nations of the world on our own soil.
Show your daughter how much you love her with this beautiful gift. It says, "To my daughter."
We thank all our distinguished international guests for having come to take possession with the people of our country. What is, after all, a common victory for justice, for peace, for human dignity. We trust that you will continue to stand by us as we tackle the challenges of building peace, prosperity, non-sexism, non-racialism, and democracy. We deeply appreciate the role that the masses of our people and their political, mass democratic, religious, women, youth, business, traditional and other leaders have played to bring about this conclusion. Not least amongst them is my second Deputy President, the Honorable F.W. de Klerk. We would also like to pay tribute to our security forces in all their ranks for the distinguished role they have played in securing our first democratic elections and the transition to democracy from black
When the president issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it was not really something that had effect in Georgia because it was more aspirational and it was more strategic. President Lincoln was trying to increase the number of freed slaves in parts of the South who could fight against the Confederacy. But the Emancipation Proclamation did very little in terms of freeing slaves at the time it was issued in 1863. And finally, in April of 1865, when General Lee surrendered to General Grant in Virginia, we began to see in Georgia a real movement towards the freeing of slaves, but it was a slow process. Emancipation came almost place by place, slowly, because there were, in many parts of Georgia, not enough federal troops to enforce the end of slavery, to enforce the emancipation. So it became a very slow process. By 1868 in Georgia, there was enough federal troops to enforce the U.S. Constitution. And there was the passage of federal amendments to the U.S. Constitution. There was what we call today a Reconstruction Constitution adopted in Georgia in 1868, and that recognized the equality of people. It recognized the right of people to work and be paid for their work. And at that point, there began to be some African Americans who were actually elected to office because they were then able to have the vote. And there was great white resistance to this. The whole society in Georgia was built on the notion that white people were superior and black people were inferior. And between 1876 and 1896, there was a back and forth. It was a 20-year period in which this whole notion of the equality of every citizen was in play every day, whether it was someone trying to vote, someone trying to go to school, someone trying to get a job that paid a decent wage, someone trying to get a house that they could own themselves. Every part of society, there was an uncertainty about just how much equality under the law the state would permit. And white folks generally wanted no equality for African Americans, and black folks obviously wanted their full citizenship, the rights that they were entitled to under the new Reconstruction Amendment. And generally, that fight went on, and there was an uncertainty about what it actually meant until a case went before the U.S. Supreme Court. And that case we now remember as Plessy versus Ferguson.
Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case in 1896 involving an African-American man named Homer Plessy. It took place in Louisiana, and Homer Plessy sat in a white-only railroad car. And Louisiana, this railroad car company, they had separate cars for whites and blacks. And so he sat in the white-only railroad car, refused to leave. The case ends up going through the lower courts. It gets to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court decided that it did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So what they decided is separate but equal doctrine came to be, that as long as you have equal facilities, and they were anything but equal in the South, as long as you had equal facilities, it was okay to separate the races. It basically, what it allowed the southern states to do is some things they were already doing with their Jim Crow laws. They make African Americans to be second-class citizens.
Jim Crow separated folks on streetcars, they separated folks in bathrooms. Black folks would not be allowed to use a spigot where water was flowing just to get a drink, even if it was used by white folks in any way. They just simply wanted to separate black people from all of white folks and then assure that in Jim Crow laws that they were unable to influence society so that they could change any of this.
Some Jim Crow laws were passed during this time to disenfranchise African Americans. Disenfranchise means to deny African Americans the right to vote, to deny a certain group of people, and we associate it with in our society to deny African Americans the right to vote. There were several different ways to disenfranchise. One of the laws was the poll tax. Well, these former slaves just coming out of slavery did not have a lot of money. They could not afford the fee to pay in all these different elections. Another was the white primary. And the white primaries, you had to be a white person to vote in it. So African Americans were not even allowed to vote in the primary elections to even pick the candidate that they wanted. And then you had literacy tests, which again, it was illegal as slaves to learn how to read and write, to teach a slave to read and write. So the majority of African Americans could not pass these literacy tests because they could not read and write legibly.
What Jim Crow era did was establish a way, with the sanction of the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, in which to indirectly infringe upon those rights with the blessings of the rest of the country and the U.S. Supreme Court until Brown versus the board.
Could you kind of set the stage for us in this time period? After the Civil War, what was the legal and social status of former slaves?
Well, of course, the Civil War ended in 1865, and it was fought in large part over the institution of chattel slavery. So slavery of, generally speaking, Black or African American slaves. And right at the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was passed. And the 13th Amendment basically said that there shouldn't be any slavery or involuntary servitude in the United States. So the institution of slavery itself had ended, but the passage of the 13th Amendment did not mean that former slaves had equal rights. A number of the former states of the Confederacy, the generally speaking Southern states, passed a number of racially discriminatory laws immediately after the end of slavery that prevented Black Americans from participating in civil society on equal terms with whites. For example, laws restricting the ability of Blacks to enter into and enforce contracts, restricting the ability of Blacks to own property, to sit on juries, to vote, to testify in court, and so forth. So there were a number of openly discriminatory laws. There were also laws that required Blacks to be employed on pain of having their labor forced. So ways of essentially reinstituting the institution of slavery.
And these were known as the Black Codes.
Those were known as the Black Codes, exactly.
In the Reconstruction period between the late 1860s and the mid 1870s, there was a concerted effort by the federal government to improve the social status and political rights of African Americans. In 1876, as part of the settlement of the presidential election of 1876, the federal government drew back some, but most of the so-called Redeemer movement really took off in the 1890s. I think 1891 is when the last real effort is made by the federal government to have a serious Voting Rights Act. And after that, the South is pretty much under control of the people who sympathized with ex-Confederates.
In both northern and southern states, there was widespread racial segregation. So there were laws that were basically codifying long existing social practices of segregated housing, segregated schools, and segregated public conveyances like steamships and rail cars. But much of that changed in the years immediately following the Civil War. Congress passed a number of federal laws that banned racial discrimination, particularly in contracting and in housing. Quite significantly, in addition to the actual federal laws that Congress passed, the country
Okay, class, raise your hand if you know where the White House is. That's right. It is in Washington, D.C. Do you know the history behind the White House or the President's house? Or think you do? No? Well, come join me as we investigate this great building's history. Our former First Lady talked about the White House back in 2016. She stated, the story of generations of people who felt the lash of bondage, the shame of servitude, the sting of segregation, but who kept on striving and hoping and doing what needed to be done, so that today I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. This was a house built by both skilled and unskilled slave labor. It was intense manual labor. Our first president, George Washington, supervised the building but never lived in the White House itself. James Hoban was the architect. He won after submitting his drawings to the commission. The building of the White House took 8 years. Our second president, John Adams, was the first president to live in the White House when the building was finished in 1800. Did you know the British burned the White House? Well, they did during the War of 1812. The reconstruction of the White House did not begin until 1814. Dolly Madison is credited with saving the portrait of George Washington as the British troops descended onto Washington. Theodore Roosevelt officially changed the name from the Executive Mansion to the White House in 1901. 1902 is the year that Theodore Roosevelt starts to remodel the White House. It is he who adds the West Wing that we know so well today. Although Washington appreciated the oval shape, and there are other oval rooms in the White House, it is President Taft who orders the Oval Office be built and used for the president's work. You're all probably familiar with the balcony that we see in so many photographs. But did you know that it was not built until the Truman presidency in 1948? In fact, the White House was not structurally safe, and almost the entire inside had to be gutted and renovated during the Truman presidency. In fact, due to all the renovations over the years, the only part of the White House that is left from when Washington was president and John Adams got to live there are the 4 exterior walls. The public was invited into the White House on a televised tour that premiered on February 14, 1962. Jackie Kennedy, First Lady, shows off her cosmetic improvements to the Great House. Today, the White House is still the president's house and is a symbol of American democracy. Thank you for joining me on this video. Please share, like, and subscribe, and keep on learning.
Afterward, they were offloaded to the processing center to begin a lengthy screening process that would change their life, either for better or for much worse. Men were separated from women and children to be screened for entry. It is difficult to imagine just how nerve-wracking this ordeal may have been to the many who had made the journey, as there was no possible way to know if they would be denied entry, even after all they went through. They were given a 6-second physical, a physical examination that in a way was both quick and efficient. The medical staff would check for easily spread diseases such as cholera or tuberculosis. They were then given a mental health check, and if an immigrant did not pass, they would be marked with chalk to be further examined. Next, the immigrants had to pass a legal inquiry. They were asked if they could read and write, where they came from and where they were headed, and if they could support themselves financially, among many other questions to prove that they would be good. Afterward, they were offloaded to the processing center to begin a lengthy screening process that would change their life, either for better or for much worse. Men were separated from women and children to be screened for entry. It is difficult to imagine just how nerve-wracking this ordeal may have been to the many who had made the journey, as there was no possible way to know if they would be denied entry, even after all they went through.
For blacks and whites to attend school together, made it illegal for blacks to vote without passing literacy tests and having grandfather clauses and poll taxes.
For the next 75 years, it was slavery, but by another name, Jim Crow. The 15th Amendment, guaranteeing the right to vote, went unenforced. African Americans in Mississippi were unequaled under the law. For most, life was little or no better than under slavery.
People really did live as if it was the Middle Ages. They were fiefs on the plantations. If they got to go to school, they got to go to school for only a few months a year during the wintertime when there was nothing to do. Otherwise, they were just animals for labor on the plantation.
They were living in virtuous slavery then. They didn't have no rights. They had to get up and go to work when they say. Couldn't lead a plantation.
In order to change their status, blacks had to be able to vote, but the government and the Klan enforced the poll taxes and literacy laws enacted in 1890. Blacks attempting to register had to know the state constitution.
They had a old cigar box or something. He had all this section of the Constitution. He'd shake it up and tell you to pick a number. Then you had to cite whatever number he pick out, the section of the Constitution, exactly word by word.
Most of the time, it was just a farce, and that made it worse when they would pick an impossible question. White people didn't have to go through all of that.
And for most blacks, the poll taxes were outrageously expensive.
That poll tax in some areas of the state could equate a month's pay for them. It could equate 2 weeks' pay. It was a significant amount because African Americans were being exploited for cheap labor. They were not paid much for their labor, so only those who had a little bit more means could even afford to pay a poll tax.
Whites also threatened the livelihoods and lives of blacks who tried to register.
Many times they talk about
literally being shot and killed. They talk about how their houses would be bombed. They talk about how they might lose the job that they had. How were they going to feed their families?
But World War II veterans returning to Mississippi after risking their lives for their country discovered that they were not allowed even the basic right of voting. As they began to demand their due, the modern civil rights movement began. Violence increased. Mississippi had more lynchings than any other state.
People were getting killed. You had a resistance built in, the poll taxes, the literacy test. We had less black people voting in 1960 than we had in 1950.
White Mississippians were talking about and saying that black people didn't want to vote.
This is why your blood sugar spikes and feet burns. Did you know type 2 diabetes is a completely reversible condition? You may not know this, but the biological reason why people struggle with type 2 has nothing to do with how many carbs or sugars you eat. A study from our lab, independent of Big Pharma, has shown that type 2 diabetes is a direct consequence of a deficiency of just one single mineral in your body. This mineral directly affects the functioning of the pancreas, which makes insulin. The difficulty is that this mineral is almost impossible to get from food in the US because it is all stuffed with chemicals and GMOs, and this is the main and only cause of type 2 diabetes. But more importantly, we discovered a simple 10 seconds technique anyone can use starting tonight, which is now clinically proven to restore sugar levels back to normal regardless of your age or current condition, all without medications, injections, strict diets, or exercises. And it works like crazy. This natural bedtime hack is so confidential. The $50 billion diabetes treating industry is fighting to ban this video from the internet as their entire business relies on your sugar levels never stabilizing as you get sicker and sicker staying as a customer for life. More than 112,000 people of all ages.
But not wanting to vote was far from the truth. Veterans such as Medgar Evers and Aaron Henry crusaded for voting rights.
They want to make sure that citizens of this country could cast their vote free of intimidation and vote suppression methods such as poll tax. Those individuals formed the base of the NAACP across the state.
They also became a support network for young students and others. One of them was Bob Moses. A teacher from New York, he came to Mississippi and they began to organize across the state.
So we actually start the project in the southwest corner of the state.
Macomb, where less than 1% of eligible Blacks were registered to vote. Statewide, the number was closer to 5%. Macomb is where Hollis Watkins met Bob Moses.
He was working on voter registration, trying to get Black people registered to vote so that they could begin to run and occupy political positions. So I told him I definitely would be willing to be a part of that.
A native of the region, Watkins talked with friends, neighbors, and anyone who would listen.
What is it that you have to lose? White people are killing Black people anyway, for no reason at all. We know that. So, if by chance you end up losing your life, for doing something that need to be done that will benefit your people as a whole, then you ought to be willing to do that, because you don't know whether they're coming to take your life later on today or tomorrow for no reason at all other than you just being Black.
Understandably, though, people were reluctant to register.
They looked at that as being something that was against the status quo. It was something that would bring about serious harm, possibly death, to them if they attempted to register to vote.
Still, people understood the need for the ballot.
People want work. They want employment. They want to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, this kind of thing, and not be knocked down every time you try to make change. Education was the key to employment, to jobs, to security. You had no access to education if you didn't have a vote. So the cycle continued.
By the early 1960s, civil rights protests in Mississippi were gaining momentum and attention. The Freedom Rides had ended in Jackson. James Meredith had entered the University of Mississippi. And in 1963, NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers was murdered.
Medgar's assassination really shifted the consciousness of some people in the country, and began the path where the action in Mississippi began to take on national importance.
Nonetheless, Black voter registration was still quite low.
By the fall of 1963, we had had a 90% failure rate. And we had probably brought 90 to 100,000 Black people to take the test, and only a few thousand ever passed it.
Then it becomes clear to us, well, this road into voter registration has sort of come to an end. It's at that point that we think about running people. We had run people for office, but now we're thinking, let's do that on a bigger scale.
They designed mock elections to teach people how to vote, and they moved to Greenwood.
Greenwood was chosen not because it would be any easier than Macomb. If anything, the Delta was going to be much harder. But we might as well send people into the most difficult place of all and use Greenwood as an anchor and build out from there.
We set up our own parallel machinery so people could register to vote if they couldn't register at the courthouse.
Aaron Henry ran for governor. Ed King was the candidate for lieutenant governor.
Bob Moses came to me and said, we want to make this an interracial ticket.
Chuck Norris shares #1 trick for dogs.
Oh, wow, you're Chuck Norris.
Yeah, that's right.
Hey, I know you love dogs. Is it true you've got a secret to help any dog get healthier?
Have you seen my video? It explains everything.
There's a mysterious illness killing dogs across America. You may have heard news reports about it spreading to almost every state. And while this illness is a major issue, there's an even bigger problem for our dogs that's been growing for decades that nobody is talking about. It may have already found its way into your home. I'm not talking about a contagious disease or even a dangerous toxin. I'm talking about what companies are putting in your dog's food. My name's Chuck Norris, and you may know me as an action star, a veteran, and a world champion martial artist. But what you might not know is how much I love dogs. And I'm about to tell you the story of how my family tragically lost 3 dogs before their time, and how it inspired me to find the true source of canine health. One we've now used to help not just our dogs, but friends and families' dogs as well. Get rid of various health issues and live the happy, healthy lives they deserve. Specifically, there are 3 canine killers that every dog owner needs to know about. When my wife Gina and I finally figured out what was really happening with our dogs and made this simple change, it was like something changed overnight. Our dogs got happier, healthier, and began running around like puppies again. That's why I need to share this secret with every dog lover I can. Let me explain what I'm talking about. I've owned dogs for over 70 years. From my first dog, Queenie, my best friend when I was a kid, to the 7 dogs my family has today here at Lone Wolf Ranch, our home in Texas. Over the years, we've owned dozens of dogs, including strays that wander onto the ranch, often in the dead of winter, even pregnant, like this beauty we named Mama Dog. We took Mama Dog in, helped her deliver her litter, and were able to find a loving home for every single pup. The Norris family prides itself on being guardians for every dog, great and small. But about 10 years ago, we started to notice a change, not just in our dogs, but all dogs. It started with our beloved golden retriever, Penny. Penny was a pure American golden, and she was a gentle and loving companion, not just to my wife Gina and I, but our young children as well. But when Penny was diagnosed with cancer at age 8, it was awful. If you've ever lost a dog, you know how terrible it can be. You're losing a member of the family, and it's especially hard on the kids. We decided to get our other dogs on a special diet recommended by a veterinarian to make sure we were doing everything we could to support their health. And sadly, our next 2 Goldens had even more health issues. Samson, one of the smartest dogs I ever met, passed away from cancer of the spleen at age 9. And we lost Bo, Samson's brother, to cancer as well, at an even earlier age of 4. I don't have to tell you, it was tragic to see these dogs taken from us so early in their lives. It's just genetic with golden retrievers, we kept hearing. But then why was this happening so suddenly, after 150 years of Goldens having long lives? And why are families across America seeing more and more health issues, not just in Goldens, but in all dogs? Nobody had an answer to this simple question. Why are millions of dogs dying before their time? As we gathered for a family prayer circle before bed, our sweet pup Ty, Samson and Bo's brother, walked into the center of the circle, like he did every night. He sat and joined us as we said the Lord's Prayer. Ty, like all our dogs, loved us like family, and we loved him the same way. And we vowed that no matter what it took, we would not lose Ty before his time like his brothers. We were going to get to the bottom of this mysterious health crisis affecting dogs across America, once and for all. I can tell you with joy in my heart that Ty lived a wonderful 14 years, well above the 9 years we've been told is the Golden's lifespan. And he was running around healthy and happy with the energy of a puppy right up until the week he passed from old age. Not only that, all 7 of our family dogs are now thriving, running, playing, and enjoying their lives like never before. What changed? How did we finally take control of our dog's health? Well, after years of research and trying everything you can imagine, the solution wasn't one change. It was actually 3. These canine killers were wrecking our dog's health. And like most dog owners, we didn't even know it. That's why I made this video, to explain each one step by step so you can get your friend on the path to good health starting right now. The first canine killer you need to stop is something you may have heard about before. Canine killer number 1, a compromised gut. You've probably heard about how important gut health is for humans. Well, it turns out it's actually even more important for our dogs. That's because the lining of our dog's digestive tracts is extremely thin. It's thinner than a piece of cellophane and even more fragile. But think about all the strange things a dog licks and eats during the day, from old food scraps to some other animal's scat outside, not to mention all the chemicals humans spray on the grass at the park or even the cleaners we use on our floors. Your dog walks on all those chemicals every day, then licks their paws. And when they do, all those toxins go right through their digestive tract. If their gut has any issues, toxins can leak out into the bloodstream, causing digestive issues like gas or mushy poops, joint problems, foul odors or breath, and even serious organ issues. So what's the solution? Dogs need to be fed specific things to support their guts and make them strong. What we found works best is natural sources of 2 things, probiotics and prebiotics. Probiotics are the healthy bacteria that live in your dog's gut and protect their digestive lining. And prebiotics is the special type of fiber these gut buddies like to eat. Some of my favorite prebiotic fibers for dogs are 2 I eat myself, ginger, as well as my favorite prebiotic, Jerusalem artichokes. But gut health is only part of the solution. The more we looked at commercial dog foods, the more we realized they were failing on one of the most basic needs a dog has. Canine killer number 2, lack of protein. Here's the secret we learned about dog foods and protein. Protein is without a doubt the number 1 most important ingredient in any dog food. It's what builds your dog's muscles, fuels their organs, and affects virtually every aspect of their health. And while food manufacturers have standards about how much protein they have to include, these are just the bare minimum that won't kill a dog. I don't know about you, but the bare minimum is not enough for my family. For instance, dog foods often contain only 18% crude protein, but an optimal canine diet is actually 30 to 35% crude protein. So many dogs are only getting a fraction of what they need to be healthy. Even so-called premium foods do this, making up for a lack of protein by loading their foods with carbohydrates like corn, wheat, and rice. But have you ever seen a wolf make a loaf of bread or boil a pot of rice? Absolutely not. Your dog, like their ancestors, needs protein to grow, stay healthy, and live a long, healthy life. But when it comes to protein, it's not just the amount they get, but the source. In the wild, when a canine makes a kill, they don't actually go for the areas you and I would eat at a steakhouse, like a ribeye or a fillet. Nope, the alpha males get first dibs on the organs, which they instinctively know are packed with all the best vitamins, minerals, and nutrients in an animal's body. That's why we make sure our dogs eat food that contain not just healthy beef, but also beef heart, liver, kidney, cartilage, and marrow. These make a world of difference in your dog's eyesight, in their coat, their digestion, and especially their joints. Marrow and cartilage is actually what they make joint supplements from. Organs even support a healthy brain. But if you want to really take your dog's health to the next level, I'm not talking about just keeping them healthy, but supercharging their body to give them the best chance at a